Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us for this introduction to the Washington Model Tool for Screening for Biased Content in Instructional Materials. My name is Barbara Suits. I am the Open Educational Resources and Instructional Materials Program Manager here at OSPI. I'm speaking to you today from Olympia on the traditional lands of the Squaxin Island tribe. I am joined by several of my colleagues this afternoon, and I'm going to let everyone briefly introduce themselves.
Good afternoon. This is Era Jackson, the Director of English Language Arts and Literacy, and I am joining you from the ancestral lands of the Squaxin Island tribe here in Tumwater, Olympia, Lacey area.
Good afternoon. I'm Arlene Crum, Director of Mathematics here at OSPI, and I'm joining you today from the traditional lands of the Puyallup people.
And I'm Laurie Dills, joining you from the traditional lands of the Squaxin people, and happy to be with you today.
So the purpose of this screening tool is really twofold. One is to help districts comply with Washington state civil rights law, but the other is really to provide educators, schools, and districts with some guiding questions on how to recognize bias in the instructional materials that may impact student learning, their sense of belonging, and empowerment. Though this screening tool is geared towards the review of core instructional materials specifically, we also really encourage you to use it to look at your supplemental as well as your intervention resources. Taking a quick walk down memory lane, this document was first released in 2009 as the tongue twister, the Washington Models for Evaluating Biased Content in Instructional Materials. Over the last few years, we've heard from a lot of people who have asked for this document to be updated to reflect our deeper understanding as we think about what instructional materials should look like for the students in our rich and diverse Washington schools. So here we are. This document is the result of cross-agency collaboration. We certainly included our Learning and Teaching Department, our Equity and Civil Rights Office, the Office of Native Education, our Migrant and Bilingual Office, and our Center for Improvement of Student Learning, as well as input from our ESD partners and school districts and other collaborating organizations. So you have a copy of the screening tool now, or you should, and if not, type it in the chat and one of my colleagues can post the link on where to get that. But after the webinar, if you are looking for where to find this tool or where on the OSPI website it could be located, I've created links to 3 different places where you might find this resource. Well, not where you might, where you'll definitely find this resource. First of all, the resource is part of OSPI's Instructional Materials Toolkit. The toolkit outlines suggested steps and highlights promising practices in the instructional materials adoption process. Most importantly, it provides model resources like this one. The resource can also be found on OSPI's Equity and Civil Rights page that deals with reviewing materials for bias, and also on our Washington OER Hub. And so these links will be on the slide deck that you will have access to. So you'll always be able to find that document when you happen to be looking for it. So as you all well know, an evaluation of content for bias is a required portion of your district's larger instructional materials selection and adoption process. What you see on the left-hand side of the screen here is an example of one of the resources in the Instructional Materials Toolkit. This one is designed to help districts involved in the selection and adoption process. In particular, it's from a math adoption, but the steps could really be the same for any content area. The screening tool really comes into play during a couple of different parts of this process. The most obvious is, of course, the step number 4, the review and selection of core instructional materials. Here's where reviewers need to examine both alignment to learning standards and target district priorities, as well as screening for biased content. But just as importantly, for a really successful implementation of this tool, district teams are really going to need to explore the resource and understand the criteria during step 3, preparing further review. The need is great for reviewers to understand what biased content looks like. Professional learning is critical not only around how to identify different types of bias, but also how to spot material that has cultural relevance and diverse representation. As with your academic content review prep, time spent here having rich conversations and providing your team with extended learning opportunities around these areas is really critical. I'm going to take a closer look at the specific strategy for screening for biased content before turning it over to our content experts to talk a little bit about all the different criteria. So first of all, your team's going to have to choose which parts of the instructional materials to analyze. We all know that core instructional material can be thousands of pages, so review teams are going to need to select a few grades, units, and lessons to really focus on. If possible, you're going to want to select at least one lower and one upper grade. And also be sure to take a look at some instructor-facing materials like teacher guides. The next step requires engaging the review team in professional learning, mentioned just a second ago. We've listed a couple of options that you might want to take a look at in the screening tool itself, but these are absolutely not the only options out there. And I think for future iterations of the tool, we'll try and add some more suggestions to that particular section as well. Before you actually dive into using the screening tool, prepare your team. Have everybody read the screening tool criteria, the examples, and the scoring directions. Be sure to discuss any statement or term that requires some additional clarity or deeper understanding. We've actually included a glossary at the back of this resource in the hopes that it might help with some of that. For each of the different criteria that we'll go over in just a moment, reviewers are going to decide if it either meets, partially meets, or doesn't meet the criteria, or if that particular criterion is just not applicable. Keep in mind, there are always going to be exceptions to these criteria. Instructional materials might be focused on a specific culture intentionally. So maybe there's just areas that are not relevant to the course. As a team, you're going to want to discuss ahead of time when it's going to be appropriate to choose not applicable on the evaluation tool. Finally, before you start, you're going to want to make sure that your review team is calibrated and that they understand the scoring system. You might want to have them practice on a sample document to make sure everyone's on the same page in terms of how they're going to review that material. Once all of that preparation is under your belt, the reviewers can actually start evaluating the material, marking criteria as met, partially met, or not met, and remembering to provide a rationale for each response that's based on evidence from the instructional materials. The last thing you're going to do is interpret the results. This is super important. I really want to highlight this is not intended as a calculate the score, and if it meets this certain level, it's good, and if it's under this level, it's not kind of a situation. Instead, this is intended to spark conversations among your team. Areas that are marked as does not meet or partially meets are really a launch point for further discussion among your instructional materials review committee. Some things to consider during these discussions might be to find out if the criteria scored similarly among team members, and if not, what accounts for the differences in scoring. This is where that reviewer identified evidence from the earlier section is really going to be critical to inform your discussion. This is also the time where your team will want to flag any new considerations or concerns that arose out of the evaluation process. So quick walkthrough, but I wanted to get to our other areas as well. Holly, did any questions come up? I haven't been able to monitor the chat, but if there are any quick questions, we can certainly address those here.
No questions as of yet, just that the link wasn't good, but I believe that has been taken care of.
Oh, perfect. Thank you, guys. All right, so with that, I am going to turn you over to Arlene to talk a little bit about the screening tool itself.
Okay, so thanks, Barbara. I'm going to take a look at some of the resource criteria, that is the different ways that you're going to take a look at your instructional materials to assure that they are free of bias. So it's important to make sure that there's representation in your instructional material that reflects the rich cultural diversity and lived experiences of all of your students. This wheel shows some aspects of diversity to consider as you review the criteria in the screening tool. You're also going to want to think about special populations or identifiers of students within your community. For example, you may have a largely military community, or consider students that you have experiencing homeless, or other particular groups that are highly represented within your population. You want to look for a variety of roles and character traits. That is, you'll need to look for stereotypes. Sometimes they can be overt. For example, depicting a male Latino teenager as a gang member. Other stereotypes may not be quite so obvious. Look for variations that could demean or exclude characters because of their race or gender or sexual orientation. Note on this section the grid format for scoring. You'll see that on the screening tool, and for more clarification on the criteria, you can always select the criteria guidance section, which you see linked in the highlighted section above the chart here. As you evaluate your materials, look for multiple perspectives and contributions from diverse peoples throughout the materials, not just a few pictures. In particular, when you are reviewing and adopting instructional materials for social studies and history, integrate the since time immemorial and tribally developed curriculum resources as are identified in our RCWs. Recommendations for reviewed instructional material may have been brought forward through the tribal consultation process. Significant representation of diverse historical figures and cultural groups is infused throughout the materials. Tokenism can be very prevalent in state and national history textbooks, which tend to mention indigenous people very sporadically and only in relation to European or Euro-American exploits. Now to Era.
Thank you, Arlene. As we go on to multicultural representation, we want us to think about what our classrooms look like today across the state. They are filled with a mix of different cultures, languages, traditions, and experiences. And we want to make sure that our instructional materials represent our students, but also represent communities that maybe are not represented in our own community, but give us a window into that experience without it being a stereotypical experience. So examples to look for: are there diverse ethnicities and nationalities are portrayed? For example, not all Asian families are Chinese, not all Latinx families are Mexican. Those are the pieces that we're also thinking about. We also ask that when you think about belief systems that are covered in instructional materials, are presented in respectful and accurately with appropriate context. And if a belief system is covered, how is it presented, and that no one belief system is positioned as superior to others. With that bearing in mind, as the ELA director, we know that there is some text that is historical that may have this, and this is an opportunity for your students to read, especially if they're older, and to have those conversations about author's intent, purpose, and what does it mean when a story does do this, or when an article or a piece of informational text does have this portrayal, and why was it done, and what can we learn from it. So as Barbara said earlier, we don't want to exclude things, but we want to be really, really thoughtful if we are including certain contexts so that everybody understands how it is, how it was seen and how it can be used. Going on to that, we also want us to think about imagery and language. We really want to think about who is being representative. And as we know, historical and primary documents, including letters, newspapers, articles, treaties, journals, photographs, census reports, cartoons, and government documents reflect the social and political and historical context in which they were created, including the biases and prejudice. These documents can be used effectively into classroom to examine the prevalence of certain biases at a particular eras in history, and to investigate how such views have influenced public policies, institutions, and people's lives. Understanding the development and impact of historical prejudices and other biases is a critical part of acquiring a more accurate and comprehensive picture of our history and our present circumstances. We know that textbooks and instructional materials, that nothing in a section is intended to prohibit, as I said before, the use of the assignment or in supplemental materials. But we want us to think about how are we presenting these materials? How does it enrich our students' understanding and to expand their viewpoint? Other examples to look for is to think about illustrations of children, showing them wearing a variety of clothing, colors, and hairstyles while engaging in a lot of different images. We want to try to go beyond the traditional gender expectations and roles, such as doctors are all men, nurses are all women. We also want to make sure that our representation of American Indian and Alaska Native peoples include photos and illustrations in contemporary context and not those from 100 to 150 years ago. So those are some other considerations for us to think about. And now I'm going to pass it over to Lori.
Thank you. So the next slide, there we go. So one of the things that's really important is making sure that families represented in the materials represent the range of families that we all have in our classrooms and our districts. And so really important to go beyond the traditional nuclear family model, making sure that single parents, adopted and foster children, et cetera, are represented in materials. And, you know, one of the interesting things that I've seen, my specialty area is comprehensive sexual health education. And while there may be images, visual images that portray a variety of people, the words on the page don't necessarily reflect the diversity in the images or vice versa. So looking not only at the visual images, but also, you know, is there a match with the words on the page? Making sure that there is not one type of family that is being held up as ideal or the best or something to strive for. And again, you know, especially in my content area, we tend to see traditional relationships involving marriage as being the only acceptable relationships. And so we're wanting to make sure that we are respectful of every kind of family that's represented in the classroom. And I think we just missed a slide. If you could go back. I wanted to mention just the importance of making sure that the guidance provided to the teachers is also consistent with the messaging and the images that are being provided to the students. Again, I've seen differences where the teacher's guide is great, but the actual materials that are provided to students are not diverse, and the opposite has been true as well. And so making sure that the instructional materials provide enough guidance for teachers on how to do all of the things that we've been talking about related to respecting a variety of diverse identities, diverse opinions and beliefs and traditions. So yeah, I think that's probably about it.
We have a couple questions in the chat.
Yeah,
There-
Holly, you want to read this? So first of all, let me apologize to Lori because when I tried to like look at the chat, I actually advanced the slide accidentally. So that will just teach me not to look at the chat. And Holly, I will rely on you to tell me when there's some questions that we need to address.
So Sarah wants to know, do you have a suggestion that I can share of another explanation for students to share instead of this is the way it was back then?
Any one of my colleagues want to address that one?
Hi, this is Era, the Director of English Language Arts and Literacy. I think that phraseology, though, I think we need to move past that phraseology. I think we need to kind of acknowledge that how this country was created and how it was built, and that there were systems put in place that made it so that certain groups and ethnicities were given more privileges than others. I think we need to face that and address that going forward instead of trying to just say that was back then, because we know that in present day society, that's not that. Those historical legacies still have impact on how things operate, specifically in the school system. So I think just being really honest that that we were not a perfect nation and that we made mistakes. And that doesn't mean we're not working towards a more perfect union, but these are lessons learned. And what does it mean? Who are we as we grow as a country and who we become? Further on, I think is the more important, is the bigger conversation of where do we go. But I think trying to say that was just the past for our students of color or for our families that are not in that traditional white upper middle class heteronormative, they know that that's still a present experience, and that things aren't perfect if you don't fit into certain stereotypes. So I think being honest with them, and I think also being honest if this is an uncomfortable conversation for you. I think our students appreciate transparency and appreciate when we are open to the fact that we're still learning about all of these pieces too.
And I'll just chime in, Lori. One of the comments in the chat box is name it for what it was: racism, sexism, homophobia, etc. And I think that's really helpful that, you know, those terms were not really, in a lot of cases, terms that were used way back when, but they're terms that we're familiar with now. We have a different standard, I think, for how we treat each other, how we talk about other people. And I think, again, yeah, name it for what it was, and that it's no longer acceptable.
There's another question asked by Jenny. Has this been shared with publishers? Wondering how we can find mass publicized resources that are able to meet these needs. With or without bias survey, this is a need for our schools. Texas drives most of the publications, followed by California.
That's a really good question. So I know that actually just prior to COVID, Scholastic publisher reached out to us about our 2009 document, asking if we were planning on creating a revision, and you know, if so, could they have access to that? This is a pretty brand new release, but I appreciate you calling that out, because yes, in addition to outreach to districts and our educational service districts and collaborators, we will also make this available to publishers if they would like to take a look as well.
And I would also like to remind people that for publishers, not for our smaller districts, I apologize, but for our larger districts, publishers, if you say this is a requirement to be put in front of even just the review committee, publishers will go above and beyond making the right textbook. If anybody has seen an article from the New York Times called A Tale of Two History Books, publishers are known for making bespoke history books, but history books that tell the story you want to tell. We can have a whole debate on whether or not that's good or for bad, but I think it's also pushing the onus on publishers, saying this is what we expect. produce it or don't produce it. And they may not be able to do it immediately, but I can guarantee you the next time you're out for curriculum adoption, they'll have it there for you.
And Joel would like to know if these PowerPoint slides will be made available.
Yes, I will make these slides available. They will be posted on the OSPI website. I have everyone's email that registered for this event, and so as soon as the recorded session and the slides become available, probably in a couple of days, I'll send out a link to where you can reach both of those. I'm also putting a link in the chat window. This is the link to our feedback site. We know perfectly well this is version 1.0 of this document. And as folks get a good look at it, as they try and implement it with their school districts, there will be questions and comments, and there will need to be improvements for the next iteration. We are planning to do that in summer of this year, after people have had a chance to put eyeballs on it and kick the tires a bit. So please use that feedback tool. We are interested in every comment that you have, and it will certainly be used to create a new and better iteration. Also note that this document is openly licensed, so as you need to make adaptations that are specific to your school district and your needs, please feel free to adapt it and make it what you need it to be.